Welcome everyone to Carleton Connect, the college's monthly webinar that connects you with new and engaging work being done on campus by faculty and staff, and out in the world by emeritus professors and alumni young and old. I'm Christopher Brunel in the Office of Alumni Relations. And as always, Carleton Connect offers everyone in the audience a chance to connect with our speakers. Just send in a chat, a comment, or a question at any time, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Our guest today is the magnificent Jonathan Capehart. He's a member of the editorial board at the Washington Post and the winner of a Pulitzer Prize for his investigative journalism. You can see him frequently on MSNBC and elsewhere. And just in the past few weeks, he's hosted conversations with people like Nancy Pelosi and Rudy Giuliani and Jamie Harrison and David Brooks and many more. He's also a member of the Carleton class of 1989. And he's been described as the best dressed man on cable TV. Yeah. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you thanks very much, Chris. That is I mean, you've watched cable TV, so you know that is a very low bar. And also I want to correct you, Chris. It is not the class of 1989. It's the class of 1889.
As we were memorably yes. Introduced on the first day of college, yes.
Very first day of college, yes. But thank you very much for hosting this, and this is really great. 330 people. Thank you so much for tuning in, and all the names that I got to see as folks were piling in. Really true. I think someone says it's like a mini reunion, and that's true. So I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A portion. I promise I will not speak too long at the outset.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we'll find out soon. Maybe you could bring us up to speed with an overview of how you got to where you are now from your time at Carleton.
So I will try to keep this brief. I think I said at opening convo, maybe now 6 years ago, I think it was,
yep.
That, just about every good thing that's happened to me in my life, I can trace back to my decision to go to Carleton. My connection to NBC started because I went over to 30 Rock after my Carleton interview at the New York Hilton. And I went to Carleton sight unseen. I first learned about Carleton from Carol Barnett, who's a class of 86, from Wisconsin, Black woman who I met on a student council convention trip to Reno, Nevada. And she was I guess what they would call now a rising freshman. She had just graduated high school and she was going to be a freshman, and I was a rising sophomore in high school. And she introduced herself to me and said, "Hi, I'm Carol Barnett, and I'm going to be a freshman at Carleton College." And so she started giving me this pitch on this school I'd never heard of. And she said, "When it's your time to apply for colleges, you should look at Carleton." So I applied to all these places, a hodgepodge of places: Swarthmore, Skidmore, Syracuse, George Washington, Howard. And I applied to Carleton, still having Carol's voice in my head. And also I wrote to Carleton admissions. And for the folks in the class of 89, you remember that little booklet that we got with the sketch drawing of Skinner Chapel, the Skinner Chapel Tower? Yep. So I had that book, and it kills me that I didn't save it, because I flipped through that little brochure so many times, all the pages fell out. I kept them together, I think, with like paper clips and rubber bands. But so that's sort of the short story of how I got to Carleton. It's all Carol Barnett's fault. And like I said, I went to Northfield sight unseen, and I'll just tell this story and then I'll stop. And I again told this story at the convo 6 years ago. This was pre-internet, pre-cell phones and all of that. And so I would call Carleton admissions office every day, sometimes several times a day, asking questions. And this one woman answered, and then I would ask for her every time, Beth Clary.
Sure.
And so one day my mother said to me, now this was after weeks of me doing this, my mother says to me, "You really should stop calling them. You're going to annoy them, and you're applying, so you don't want to ruffle any feathers." So I was like, okay, fine. So a full 24-hour period goes by, and at night, like after dinner, the phone rings. And I answer the phone, and it's, "Hi, is this Jonathan?" I said, "Yes." "This is Beth Clary from Carleton College." And I said, "Hi." And she said, "We didn't hear from you yesterday." We figured we'd call and see if you had any more questions. And to me, that phone call not only meant the world to me, because as a kid, I'm trying not to make any mistakes and trying not to upset people. And so for someone to reach out that way was really quite touching. But it also meant, I found out later, it meant a lot to my mother, because with me leaving home and going to college and going far away, which for her was not being able to jump in the car and drive within a few hours, she said to me, "I felt like I was sending you to a nurturing place, some place where there would be people looking out for you and taking care of you." And that is true in my case. That was indeed the case. And so, Carleton is holds a very special place in my heart. Every chance I get, as I did this weekend on television, I try to drop a little Carleton College into the conversation, as I did with I think it was with Congresswoman Omar.
It was with Omar,
and,
yes.
Yes, with Congresswoman Omar. So, so that's how I got to Carleton, and then we can get into all the other stuff, but that's how I got there, and that's how I'm here now.
That's a great story. Thanks, Jonathan. And I'll remind people, send in questions at any time, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. A couple people have written in beforehand and also now with questions about the media. We are now talking about our current world. And one of them asks about the difference between how the media covered the election in 2016 and how it's covering it this time around. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the changes that you've seen in the world of media over those 4 years.
So the big thing is, I think media now has its eyes wide open to a whole lot of things that, understandably, they couldn't even wrap their minds around actually happening or being true. So in 2016, let me start with now President Trump, candidate Trump, gets into the race. No one took him seriously. No one took him seriously at all. And the cable channels and newspapers covered him because, well, one, he was catnip. Here's a guy running for president who would say and do things no person running for president had ever said or done, at least in our lifetime. So it was just sort of like, hey, let's tune into the daily car wreck. But I then started paying attention a little more closely after he announced for president and he said what he said about Mexicans. The turning point for me was about a month later when it may have been a little longer than a month later, when he said that John McCain wasn't a hero because he got captured. And I took a step back and I thought, okay, if his poll numbers don't go down after that comment about the former nominee and a war hero in this Republican Party, then something's wrong. And instead, his poll numbers went up. And I started paying much more attention to him, what he was saying, and taking him more seriously. Unfortunately, most of my colleagues in the press, print and television, radio, you name it, weren't taking him seriously. Meanwhile, flip side, Hillary Clinton, who has been in public life for more than 30 years, the standards by which the two candidates were being judged were completely different. Hillary Clinton, I wrote a column about this, Hillary Clinton was judged by the presidential standard. You want to be president of the United States? Well, then you must answer all these questions, all these very serious questions. We must hold you to account for your emails and hold you to account for whatever. And meanwhile, Donald Trump's getting a pass on everything. He gets the nomination, and now suddenly there's some people in the press who think, well, he's got a 50-50 shot of being president, so maybe we should start kind of taking him seriously. And then he won. And then he comes to Washington, he's president, and it took way too long for particularly the Washington press corps to understand and realize who they were covering and what kind of president they were dealing with. Fast forward to now, as you see from the press briefings, like the gloves are off. I think the gloves are off now because of the pandemic and the toll it's taken on the American people and the American economy. And just by the time the briefings started, the press corps had become pretty used to the president lying and the White House press secretary lying. And so now what we have is a press corps that is much more willing than in 2017 to call the president out to his face, to call the president out in their reports, to even the way we talk. I mean, the whole conversation about, oh my God, do we call him a liar in print? How do we fact check him with the chyrons on TV or in copy? All those conversations were taking place in 17, 18, 19, whereas so right now you have a different style of journalism when it comes to covering this president. And when it comes to the lies, or when it comes to the efforts at voter suppression, or when it comes to all, the other things that it appears the Republican Party and the Trump campaign is trying to do vis-a-vis the upcoming election, the press now is no longer lacking in imagination. I'll tell this one quick story in terms of lacking in imagination. I'm at the Democratic convention. It's hours after the first emails had, I think it was the DNC, like a WikiLeaks hack that led to the resignation of Debbie Wasserman Schultz as the DNC chair on the eve of the Democratic convention. And I was talking to a high-ranking Democratic Party source, and she is unspooling for me all of this stuff that was happening in terms of the hacked emails and who was involved. And in those moments, since it was off the record, I didn't have a notebook. I didn't take out my notebook and start writing it down. I wish I had, because all of the things she told me that night over the course of she's talked for an hour nonstop, unspooling all of these things, Russians and Ukraine and all of this stuff. And I was like, what are you talking about? This is nuts. Yeah. And now here we are.
That's quite a story. Yeah. A couple of follow-ups on the way in which the media needs to or chooses to respond. Can you say a little bit more about terminology? You mentioned the question about, do we call something a lie or misinformation or misrepresentation? How does that get chosen in your line of work? How does one talk about these things, and how much does one actually, by bringing them up in the media, give them legitimacy?
So the first thing in terms of nomenclature, so being that I'm on the opinion side, I've long been able to call the president a liar, as well as calling him a racist, which was another thing that the news side was very reticent to do. So I'm not on the news side. The news side, is tradition bound, hide bound. Well, we don't call the president a liar. We don't call the president a racist. But because of the things that have happened and the consequences of the things that have happened, it has caused newsrooms on the news side to take a step back and decide, are we doing a disservice by not calling a lie, or saying that the president is lying when it is clear as day that he is lying, or that what he has said is racist? Remember, before it was racially charged statements or could be construed as racist. And now it's just, no, the president said something racist. So, those conversations took a long time to get started. And then it took a little while for there to be a bit of resolution. But that is because it took a while for reporters and institutions to shed this notion that there should be deference to the president. And this, it spanned, both Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, but that's because you had presidents who showed infinitely more respect for the office and also for the American people than the person who was there now. And so again, when you have hard and clear evidence that this is a lie and that this is racist, that you are not serving the public by not calling it out for what it is. And that's another thing that I think is a good thing, a good lesson that the media has learned, that it's got to call it out.
Yeah. One of the things presumably that makes that more of a challenge is the mainstream media's obstacles raised by social media and the misinformation there. How do you get your job done given the challenges of the energy that comes into the national discourse from other news sources, if we can call them that?
Well, I mean, the social media just by itself is a whole that's a whole other topic. Yep. And figuring out how to do my job in this environment, it changes daily. It's a rolling thing. But the thing that I've noticed is that I spend a lot of time, and if anyone follows me on Twitter, although I haven't had to do it of late, maybe because I haven't been writing as much as I used to, but I used to yell at people on Twitter and on Facebook for commenting on a column they didn't actually read.
Sure.
That is my biggest pet peeve of social media, is that people, everyone's in a silo, so they're only getting reinforced ideas. But then because of social media and the dwindling of our attention spans, and also everyone's just busy, so I get that. But, if I wrote pieces the way that most people read, I'd be fired. I mean, folks, news consumers by and large are unbelievably lazy. And in that laziness, they are sharing misinformation. They are sharing parody stories that they think are true. I had someone today send a story to me, Don Lemon. This is on Twitter. Me, Don Lemon, Rachel Maddow, and someone else. And it's a story purportedly about President Obama and how he's to blame for something involving the Supreme Court. And I thought, that's weird. So I clicked on it. And the first thing I see the headline, and the first thing I see, because to me, it's like, okay, what organization is this? Who wrote this? So I looked down at the name. It was a name I didn't recognize, but next to it, it said Obama fan fiction. And then on the far right side, there's a picture, a really unattractive picture of Michelle Obama with the headline, Michelle Obama admits she's a man. So I then tweet back at her saying that you must do better. It is a parody account. It says Obama fan fiction. It has derogatory, an ugly picture of Mrs. Obama and a derogatory headline. Yeah. This is not real. And then she writes back, oh, well, it didn't say that it didn't say Obama fan fiction when I looked at it. And I'm just sort of like, yeah, right. But that's the problem of social media. It requires, unfortunately, for everyone who's not a journalist to come at information as if they were a journalist. There's so many things that I go through, as I did with that, to make sure that whatever it is I'm reading is from a reputable source, and is, and once I didn't even bother to read the piece, because once I saw fan fiction, I knew that why bother? But if folks want to be as informed as they think they are, or pretend to be at the latest cocktail party when we used to go to those things.
Yes.
You got to look at the website. You've got to go to, if it's a website you've never seen before or never heard of, go to the About tab, click on About, see who the people are. Don't recognize anyone. Google the person who's the leader, or if it's organizations, Google the organizations. And more often than not, you will find out that they are attached to some kind of political outfit, either left-leaning or right-leaning, but they're trying to purport that they're being factual when really they're not.
Yeah.
But the whole social media thing is that's another conversation for you to have with someone who's way deep in it.
Well, many of us are by this point, for sure. To follow up on something you mentioned just a minute or two ago, and that I remember from one of your interviews a few years ago through Carleton, it has to do with you mentioned silos and how easy it is for so many of us to get our information from just a few sources. How do you go about making sure that you unsilo yourself?
It's difficult. It really is. I mean, I try to follow, conservative or right-leaning commentators. I will follow some right-leaning institutions. But given where the Republican Party is and where the right is, my threshold for following folks on that end is, I don't know, is it low or is it high? It's really difficult for me to add another person or another institution because of sort of the willful, I don't want to say ignorance. It's just sort of the sort of willfully following behind and falling behind the president and completely junking decades or generations worth of beliefs in the short span of a presidential term to go along with the current president. So, I try hard to find out, what the other side is thinking. Mm-hmm. When Charles Krauthammer was writing for the Washington Post before he passed away, he was someone who we were on complete opposite sides. I would find myself literally cursing as he, ripped President Obama to shreds. But the thing about Charles Krauthammer was that his critiques of the Obama administration and the Democratic Party were grounded in something. And more often than not, his critiques, however horribly, nastily he put them, they were actually, I could see what he was saying. And right now, there are very few conservative columnists I can follow without having my eyes roll completely back in my head, because they are making arguments in favor of President Trump that 10 years ago, they never would say. Yeah. So it's difficult. It really is difficult to expand my universe. But I mean, in the business that I'm in, I see what the other side, what the other side is thinking and saying. And so I'm not completely siloed, but I'll admit I'm siloed a bit.
Well, actually on two points on that. One is that we got a comment saying, the question being, how do you actually manage to keep your cool when you're interviewing people who say things that seem outrageous? So you do manage. Pro tips for us that we can use for ourselves?
It's really hard. On a radio show 2 years ago during the midterms, I had a person I was friendly with, Republican, who was triggered by a word in a question and then suddenly went off the deep end. And I just was like, that's not what I said. That's not, okay, we're done. I never had him on the show again because, as I said, I am not going to get into an argument with someone over whether 2 + 2 = 4. Mm-hmm. Um, the most recent interview I did with someone who went off the deep end was Mayor Giuliani.
Yes.
When he was on, interviewing him on MSNBC. And I'd interviewed him before when he was mayor, and I'd seen his interviews. So I was prepared for, Barracuda Rudy. But the pro tip for, dealing with someone who is out there is to be comfortable and grounded in, one, what you believe in, and two, in the facts. And for me, as a journalist who has to get into these conversations, usually in public on television, I don't have the leeway and latitude to curse anybody out, as you very well would be able to, either at a bar or at a family cookout or something. And so for me, it's always been about, here are the facts that I have, and I know they are facts. And as long as I'm standing on that firm foundation, I'm fine. And it's not to say that I'm not listening to the other person. And that's the other tip. Listen to what the other person is saying, because half the time people don't feel like they're being heard. So listen to them, and then totally confound them by then taking what they've said to you and then answer them, especially if you have the facts on your side, and do it with a smile.
We can all use some pro tips. Thanks for those. You've mentioned, and it's a common way to talk about things as the other side. One of the questions we just got was, why haven't we heard anything about a third party? That this seems to be the first election in which there are apparently only two parties and nothing else to talk about. What do you make of that disjunction?
Oh, well, I think 2016 is the reason. There were third party candidates, Jill Stein, is it Gary Schwartz from Alaska? I can't remember what was his name, but there were two third party candidates in the 2016 election. And in some of the swing states, I believe Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, that the margin of victory for Trump was smaller than the amount of votes taken by Jill Stein or the other person whose name I can't remember, who ran as third party candidates. I think now in 2020, you're not hearing any conversation about third party candidates, because people realize that there are two people in this election. One of them is going to be president of the United States. And I think the existential threat posed by President Trump, I think, has clarified things for a lot of people who either didn't vote in 2016, voted third party in 2016, or voted for Trump in 2016.
Sure. Although on the state level, there is a much wider range of third and fourth party candidates as well. How much of your job is focused on those state races?
My job, I have no focus on the state races professionally. I do it as, hobby. Like, where's Wisconsin today? Where's Michigan today? The one thing I think we've all learned from 2016 is national polls are great. But if you want to know or have a clearer idea of what could possibly happen truly in the presidential election, you have to look at the local polls, the state polls. And so while I'll look at the fact that Biden is ahead, I think it's 12 points or 16 points in the latest ABC News Wall Street Journal poll, I will then go and look at the polls for Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida, just to get a look-see, and Iowa at this point.
Sure. Yeah. We're getting many more questions. If you don't mind taking a step back to
Sure.
Carleton, one of the questions that came in has to do with, how do students who are interested in doing work like you're doing enter into the media these days?
Oh, wow. Well, I'll say this much. It is easier these days than it was when I was this snot-nosed kid running around campus telling everyone I wanted to be a television journalist. Back then, you just had the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, and 3 network television broadcasts, although by then CNN was around. And the world was closed. That world was closed. And the only reason why I was able to break into it, such as I did, was that my uncle, as I mentioned before, worked at NBC as an electrician. He wasn't a producer. He wasn't a writer. He was the guy you called if your light bulb blew out or if you needed something electrical fixed. But because he let me in the building and I was able to actually talk to someone who worked in the business, that's how I was able to make my way. Today, because of the internet and because of sort of the democratization of information, now when young people ask me, how do I break in? I want to be a writer or want to do whatever. I tell them, well, just write. Yeah. You have an idea? Write or put it on Facebook, put it on Medium. There's a great writer, R. Eric Thomas, who is, he writes for Elle.com. He is the one who coined the term Auntie Maxine for Maxine Waters. He wrote this brilliant piece analyzing a 10-second or 15-second press conference that Maxine Waters did after Democrats met with James Comey in 2017. And it was so brilliantly written and so funny. It was hilarious that his career took off. And so I did an interview with him, and he said he started by just writing stuff on Facebook. And, friends would be sending messages, oh, this is really funny. And someone from Elle read one of his things and sent him a message saying, hey, could we talk? And so he was like, sure. So they talk, and he couldn't believe that they were offering him to do for pay what he was doing just for kicks as an aspiring writer. That's how much more open things are now, particularly for writers. But again, if you want to break into television as well, and nowadays, reporters have to be their own camera people as well. Right. Go and shoot a story and upload it, put it out there, and then you have something to show. I think the world now, especially this profession, is much more open to people with drive and creativity and a voice, really. So that would be my big piece of advice.
That's great. Thank you. Well, and on the other hand, we also hear about press layoffs. Some of the stories make it sound like it would actually be more difficult to get into media.
Well, in that regard, I mean, local media is being decimated. It really is. It's shrinking. Yeah. Luckily, for the national papers like the New York Times, because of its digital subscriptions, things are great. At the Washington Post, things are great because we have a multi-billionaire owner who bought us, the equivalent of pocket change. But, he bought the paper, and as a result has, not just bought the paper, but has pumped money into the paper so that it could ramp back up and get back to full steam. But that being said, at the local level, it is much more difficult. But that being said, you don't go into journalism to become rich or anything like that. You go into it because you have stories to tell, or there are stories of communities or people you want to tell. In a way, I sometimes liken it to public service, because what we do it is a public service in terms of imparting information, but in some ways, it's the people who do it well are the people who feel it's a calling. And so Like if it's sort of like if you say, well, I'm an artist, I want to paint. Well, you really have to want to paint. And so if you want to be a journalist, you really have to want to be a journalist um, in order to deal with all the stuff you would have to deal with.
Yeah, sure. Do you mind if we take a little turn in the conversation to some of the other events of the last several months? And I'm thinking about the murder of George Floyd and
Mm-hmm.
everything that has followed before from that, and of course that came before that. Do you want to talk about what it's been like to cover that aspect of the American experience, and especially as a Black man to do so?
Well, I mean, look, it goes back to even before George Floyd. I mean, really, the killing of Trayvon Martin in 2012, if you want to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, if you want to talk about the start of it, it was then. And it was the result of writing about his killing, his murder, that, you know, I dove, you know, head and feet first into that story, from his murder to, you know, all the court papers to the trial, everything, and just sort of writing about my experience as a Black man in this country. And what I found interesting is this is when I realized that people were looking, they'd been reading me for years, but now suddenly here was something that I was writing about that was deeply personal. And they were learning as much about me as they were about the Black people around them. I had two colleagues at MSNBC who came up to me after that first Trayvon Martin piece, where I said, you know, as a kid, you know, my mom gave me the talk, and here are the rules that I had. And they came to me with tears in their eyes. Like, I have a 16-year-old son, white colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
I have a 16-year-old son. It never occurred to me that I would have to tell them to never run in public, or to be afraid of the police, or any of the things that you were taught. And so when I heard from them and I got emails from people, that's when I discovered that the voice that I had, when I thought I was out there writing just because, well, I've got this job where I can write whatever I want, but it was, there were people who were listening. And so then as the names started piling up, you know, Walter Scott, Tamir Rice, all of them started piling up, you know, it got to a point, quite honestly, where I had to, it just became too painful. It became too painful. It became, I mean, it was really hard to write about yet another Black person killed at the hands of either police or a vigilante. And here's how bad it got for me. It was a Saturday night. I remember we heard sirens all the time at the place where we used to live, so I didn't pay any attention to them. I'm watching the news and I hear, oh, yet another Black person shot and killed by police, this time in Washington, D.C. It was a motorcycle chase, and it ended at the corner of New Jersey and M. And I just heard it. It washed over me. My husband and I went out to go for brunch. I think this was a Sunday. And I'm walking down the stairs. I look to my left and I see, you know, police cars and yellow tape and everything. And I just look, I don't think anything of it. We go to brunch, come back. I look, it's still there. It's still happening. I got an instant message from a local elected official, a direct message on Twitter asking me, hey, when are you going to write about this killing of this unarmed Black man on the motorcycle that happened a block from your apartment? And that's when all the people, I was like, oh my God, that was right there. And so I think I ended up writing a piece saying, you know, I've become so numb and I don't know how else to describe it, that I'd so walled myself off that I couldn't even see what was happening. Literally, I could see it when I got, I look out the window, I could see still the police cars and the yellow tape. So fast forward to the killing of George Floyd. By then, I had stopped watching all of the videos of Black people being killed, and with George Floyd, it was I was especially emphatic because you watched him die over the course of 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And I even at one point was doing television pre-George Floyd. I can't remember who the other video, it might have been Ahmaud Arbery, where they were showing the tape and I took my earpiece out and looked down, didn't even, because I didn't want to hear any screaming, didn't want to hear any gunshots, didn't want to even see it, because people needed to know and understand that, well, yeah, I have this job, I've written about these things, but at a certain point, I have to step away and stop. That doesn't mean I haven't written about George Floyd and all of those things, especially in with the demonstrations that happened after his killing, and then the president's response, which was just egregious. But I do think that what gave me hope was just the outpouring of outrage on the streets of America, all across America. That was salve on my soul, to be able to see that and be completely distressed by the response to those demonstrations, but also, really inspired by those demonstrations.
Yeah. And the stories are going to need to continue to be written and told, but
sure.
But it's an exhausting experience, I'm sure. Yeah, thank you. Do you mind turning to something perhaps slightly more optimistic? If we end up with President Biden, what do you see the role and the work of the media becoming? Is it going to be back to what it was? Is it going to be a new normal? What will it feel like?
Well, I mean, I don't know what it will feel like. I think things will, well, first, knock on wood, for speaking for myself, I hope Joe Biden and Kamala Harris win the election 3 weeks from today. If they do, I think because they are both institutionalists, because they are from they are not like the incumbent. And so I think certain norms and certain customs that have been done away with or ignored will return. I think that, the White House press secretary will be someone who the press and the American people can trust. I think, in a President Biden, you will have someone who not only respects and reveres the office, but also the Constitution. And so just through tone and behavior, things will change, things will go back to normal in that regard. I do think that the media, because of what it went through with President Trump in a Biden-Harris administration, they will be much more, much more alert to what's going on, to lies. And now, actually, because, the rhetorical handcuffs have been removed in terms of calling a president a liar, if Joe Biden, if he were president, were to say something flat out a lie, he can guarantee he will be called a liar. Yeah. So, that I think might be the change. But, if there is a Biden-Harris administration, that doesn't mean that America will be free of the Trump presidency. If there's a Biden-Harris administration, I keep telling people, particularly on some shows at MSNBC, that the amount of things that reporters are going to find or learn about through the new administration, not just in the White House, but in the agencies. We spend so much time focused on the White House that there's no reporting really on what's Ben Carson, Secretary Carson, doing at HUD. What's happening at HHS? What's happening at Commerce? What's happening at Defense? What's happening at Agriculture? I mean, I think a lot of people in my business think, oh my God, a Biden-Harris administration is going to be really boring. And I look at it as completely different. A Biden-Harris administration is going to be really interesting because of the things we would be able to discover as a result of a change administration.
Yeah, and yes, and the opportunity for that much wider a focus than what we're getting now. You mentioned, and it's true, the election day is 3 weeks away. Of course, voting has already begun in many places. Do you want to give us your sense of what the media are going to be able to do on election night? Or is it going to be over the course of days and weeks that a race gets called and that the decisions get talked about?
I think the most important thing that we in the media can do is to model the restraint and reserve and caution that this election season demands. We already have, Trump is already and has been for months sort of calling into question the results, calling into question the legitimacy of ballots, saying that if the election isn't called on election night, then it's fraudulent, when we know that there are states that there are many states who allow for the counting of ballots to go on days, if not a couple weeks after election day. And so it is imperative that the media not play the president's game. One, because it's the president's game, but two, if we were to do that, we would be playing into our own suppression as voters, and it would not do a service to the American people, especially if all the votes aren't counted. In the end, that's what a president should be demanding, that all the votes that are legally cast in a presidential election should be counted, and should be counted for however long that state elections board allows for that to happen. And so, it is my hope that, and I think I just saw somewhere that the Washington Post is not going to call a race, and I think other media organizations are making similar announcements, basically saying we're not going to be a part of the problem this time. I think maybe there's some on this who remember, I think it was the presidential election of either 80 or 84, where they called the race, but California was still voting.
Right.
And by calling a race while states are still voting, you're basically telling voters who might be standing in line, well, why should I bother? Yep. And so as a result of those complaints, now anchors, particularly on television, like they wait until 11 p.m. Eastern. I'll never forget watching Brian Williams the night of President Obama's first election. Here's a pro tip. Listen to what the anchors are saying, the word choices that they use, the verb tense, because that signals what's coming. So I heard Brian Williams talking about his language started going from being, speculative to being almost definitive. And then 11 o'clock hit, and he said, and now we can announce that Barack Obama will be the next president of the United States. And so, you've got people who are on television and they're trying to tell you without telling you and getting into trouble.
Mm-hmm,
but if you listen very carefully, they're telegraphing what the news will be. And it's my fervent hope that, the blue wave of 2018 will be a tsunami in 2020, if only to have that kind of tsunami so that there's no doubt.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. And it must be not easy for newscasters who want to broadcast the news to have to exercise restraint in that way. But we'll look forward to that being the case. We don't have too many minutes left here. A pair of questions, and you're free to answer either one, but maybe they belong together. One is, what keeps you up at night? And alternatively, what gets you up in the morning?
So
possibly coffee.
Well, what keeps me up at night is worrying about the direction of the country. I've said many times on television and in a column that this election is not just a choice between President Trump and former Vice President Biden. It is a choice between American democracy and white supremacy. And the fact that I am not quite sure which America will choose is what keeps me up at night. As we get closer to Election Day, I'm actually feeling better than I did, say, 3 months ago. But given the experience of 2016, I'm not looking at anything being in the bag. What gets me out of bed is, I guess, my inherent optimism. That's not to say that there haven't been days or even weeks where it's just sort of like, oh my God, I can't do this. But, I have to say that America's response to the killings of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and the fact that people in the middle of a pandemic were so angry about what happened to a fellow American that they decided to leave their homes, put on masks, socially distant, not all of that, but it was important enough to them to come out to the streets, and not just in Minneapolis, and not just in Washington because the president is here, but in cities and towns all across the country, and then to see it happen around the world. That is what's inspiring and what gives me that extra push. And it's my hope that there are more people like that than there are people who want a maintenance of the status quo as we know it right now, and who would like to see it expand, because that is my big fear is a second Trump term, and not just a second term of him in the White House, but what that means about our country at home and abroad. And then more specifically, what that means in terms of actions by this president against his political enemies.
Speaking of political enemies, have you ever been called out by name by the current president?
Oh, good. Okay, here we go. So technically, I have not been called out by name by the current president. And I say technically because he called me out while he was a candidate and before he started making sport of beating up on reporters by name. So in 2015, after he came down the escalator and said Mexicans are rapists, and he said all sorts of other things, by July, I wrote a column that just said, you're running a racist campaign. And this is no way a person who wants to lead this country should be speaking. And he was, as was his way, had the column that I wrote printed out, and then in a Sharpie, he wrote, "Jonathan, you are the racist, not I. Get rid of your hate in quotes. Best wishes, Donald Trump." And I was like, wait, what? So that was his attack on me in July of 2015. That was, however, the second time he sent me one of those faxed missives. And that was, the first time was after he decided not to run for president in 2012. And I wrote a piece saying, well, of course he got out, because his poll numbers were dropping. And he wrote back, well, nope, my poll numbers were doing just fine. They were going up. Best wishes, Donald Trump. He is somebody who, after he sent me that, a mutual friend let me know that he wanted to talk to me. So I said, sure, I'll talk to him. Calls him, I call, or he calls me. Mm-hmm. We have a lovely conversation on the phone. He says, hey, anytime if you're in New York, just give me a call and come by and we can meet in person. And I thought, sure, okay. Hung up the phone. I was in New York for something MSNBC related. And I thought, let me test this. So I called his office. I was out on the street. I was out on Fifth Avenue, probably shopping. But I called and I said, hey, it's Jonathan Capehart, Washington Post, I'm in town. Is Mr. Trump available? She says, oh yeah, come by in 45 minutes. So I went to Trump Tower and did the whole thing of going up the elevator and into his office and sat in his office. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the video of him sitting at his desk with the bald eagle that like lunges at him. Yeah. That's the office I was sitting in. It's packed with memorabilia. Lots of Trump memorabilia. And we met for about an hour, just talking politics, because by then he was trying to be, a little power broker. He had just met with Sarah Palin. I think it was Mitt Romney or Herman Cain was going to come up to see him later that day or the next day. And when I left, I thought, okay, we had our disagreements about the birther stuff, but, he's somebody I think I could, spend time with and get to talk to. And mind you, this was 2012, right. 2013. Fast forward, and he starts running for president, and I'm thinking, who is this person? I don't know. This is not the person I talk to. And other people who have spent time with Donald Trump, if anyone who watches Morning Joe, you hear Mika and Joe talk about the fact that the person who's president now is not the person they knew. And I understand where that comes from. I don't know who that person I met is. That person doesn't exist anymore. And I think that, he has pushed so hard to do whatever it is that he's doing that he has laid waste to whatever positive legacy he thought he was going to have.
That is quite a story. Thank you, Jonathan. We've come to the end of our time here, and I just wish we had another couple hours, but we'll have to leave it there.
Yes.
Thanks to everyone who tuned in for the show, whether this is your first time with Carleton Connects or whether you're a regular. I hope you'll tune in again next month on November 11th for a talk about archaeology. We'll be joined by classics professor Alex Nodell and Liza Davis, and they'll be sharing the fruits of their recent excavations and investigations of ancient Greece. So watch your alumni email newsletter for more details. Check out our digital platform for many more virtual offerings. And if you have feedback for Carleton Connects, please do get in touch with me, Christopher Brunel, in the Office of Alumni Relations. Jonathan, thanks again very much.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks very much.
And thanks to everybody who tuned in. See you next month.
Bye everybody.